Hello, Literature and Writing 308A students. So today we're going to be talking about effective spirituality, or effective piety as it's often called, in the late Middle Ages, and in particular the book of Margery Kempe and how she participates in this tradition. So the work of Margery Kempe and another English writer named Julian of Norwich is part of a long tradition of religious writing that dates back to very early English poetry. Like you may remember, we saw with Caedmon's hymn when I talked about another poem called The Dream of the Rood. So the tradition of religious poetry and religious writing in England is strong.
Young professor, I have to admit that I really do admire the work of the mystics, Julian of Norwich and Margery Kempe. They heard a call from God and they wrote about their experiences with affective spirituality.
That's exactly right. Do you want to explain a little bit about effective spirituality for us?
Where they felt the pains of God in their body.
Thank you.
The pains of Christ on the cross, they felt in their body. They saw visions, and then they reported on their personal experiences with God.
Yes, exactly. One of the ways effective spirituality manifests is in vivid visual and auditory stimuli. So affective, the term affective means of or pertaining to the emotions. They affect us. The affectations are our emotions, or how we express or feel our emotion. Just like Sister Eglantine was saying, one of the ways in which effective spirituality manifests is in vivid visual and auditory stimuli, maybe what you would now call a hallucination, possibly. But those are thought to be a gift from God, that you experience the suffering or the pain or whatever it is that Christ experienced or that Jesus experienced during what's called the Passion, or the time that he was on the cross. The viewer or the experiencer, the person who's having this experience, will feel those pains themselves. And it's not necessarily only Jesus. Sometimes it's Mary or some of the other people involved, but it's centered typically around the suffering of Jesus on the cross, oftentimes. There were men who were practicing mysticism long before medieval women were able to get into the game, but eventually they got involved with it. And it's called the mystical tradition. And in the medieval period, it turns into something specifically called effective spirituality. Because women were really legally not allowed to write in most genres unless they were aristocratic, and they were certainly not allowed to be writing about religious experiences, this was one genre that was open to them, one way that they could participate, because the medieval Catholic Church didn't have a lot of official ways for women to contribute.
What do you mean women didn't contribute to the church? We certainly did. Just because we weren't allowed to preach or lead doesn't mean we didn't take up positions of leadership.
I'm just about to tell them all.
Women found ways to write about our experiences with God and talk about them and tell other people. Look at Hildegard von Bingen. Look at Birgitta of Sweden. Look at Margery Kempe. Look at Julian of Norwich. A whole tradition of women writing about their own experiences with God. It was one of the first ways women could even write, youngling. I bet you didn't know that.
Can you have some patience, sister? Goodness gracious sakes. I want to point out that some folks have seen the work of these authors like Kempe and like other mystics who in the medieval period include Richard Rolle and the anonymous author of a text called The Cloud of Unknowing. They represent an attempt to gain a more personal connection with God. Instead of being mediated through a male church official, this was a way one could experience God directly, right on the body, which is a unique and different way and allowed women a chance to get a more direct experience of God. The issue of the direct connection to the Christian God is going to be a huge part of what stems and motivates people in the Reformation. So Sister Eglantine is right. There's a number of female mystic writers that come before Kempe that she's operating in that tradition of. One of the earliest is Hildegard von Bingen, which is a German writer. You can see that she's quite early in the tradition, at the very end of the 11th and early 12th century. She wrote the Book of Life's Merit and the Book of Divine Works, and she also illustrated her own work. And that's what this is a picture of. You can see the four-way split here is representative of the medieval worldview. They believed everything was represented by four elements: air, earth, water, and fire. And those four elements made up all of the things that existed on the earth. And you can see that that's what this earth is made up of. And then there's little people and creatures walking around on top of the earth as well. And there's little Hildegard herself writing in the corner and having this vision that she has that you can see. Another example that was from the 14th century, just like Julian and right before Kemp, who is at the turn of those 2 centuries, is Birgitta of Sweden. She wrote the Revelations, as you can see. This text is a piece of the Revelations. You can see what the original looked like. Here's a representation of Bishop Hemming of Finland meeting with Birgitta of Sweden there on the right. Julian of Norwich is an English writer who actually meets with Margery Kempe at one point, which is really cool. She wrote something called A Book of Showings, which is in the Norton Anthology, if you want to check it out. It comes kind of right before Margery Kempe's piece. This is the beautiful copy of it here. There is no picture of Julian or representation of her, so this is a picture of St. Julian. And the only reason we call Julian Julian is because she comes from St. Julian's Church in Norwich, so that's why she's called Julian. She was something called an anchoress, which meant that she was bricked into a cell as though she were dead, basically. And there was a little window for her to exchange her bodily fluids and get food from. And this little cell was on the outside of a church, and there was a little window so she could take mass and see inside. One window towards the church, one window out from the church. And she lived there for over 20 years in that little cell, which is when she wrote her Book of Showings, and then she revised them over 20 years. So she has 2 versions. A second version where she is more reflective and has contemplated her showings for 20 years. So she was quite remarkable. And one of the only reasons she got away with writing so much is that she was bricked up in a cell where she really couldn't do anybody any harm. Not the case for Margery Kempe. So Margery Kempe is who you're reading. She wrote the Book of Margery Kempe, which is the first autobiography in English, which is very, very exciting. She often drew the ire of the Catholic Church in England because she would travel around and talk about her experiences, her visions, and her experiences with God, and this would get her into trouble.
You had to be careful when you were trading on the territory of the Catholic Church. They had quite a bit of power, but Margery Kempe was a clever one, and despite being jailed multiple times, she still managed to get free. She managed to be allowed to speak about her religious experiences and to receive official permission to do so from the local church authorities, which is pretty impressive. It's hardly the damsel in distress you hear everyone talking about.
She was no damsel in distress, that's for certain. I think my students are about to learn there were actually very, very few of these damsels in distress in the medieval period, even though people would like us to believe that. Kempe's text was also the first autobiography written in English. She's the first one to have written an autobiography in English. And her text also participates in a medieval genre known as travel writing or travelogue, where people would travel around and write about their experiences. So her text participates in 3 literary traditions: the tradition of affective spirituality, the tradition of autobiography, and the tradition of travel writing or travelogue. It's a pretty rich text.
You can't really talk about feminism in the medieval period because it didn't exist, but these women were working for equal rights, whether they knew it or not.
I think you're absolutely right, sister.
You know, if I were to be on TikTok, I think I'd be a success.
No.